Hello there, it's Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter here. I've got my sewing machine out and I'm going to carry on with the patchwork throw that I'm doing for a friend for Christmas. This is the Christmas rose throw that I started with 10-inch squares. This is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, go back and watch that. In this video, I'll be showing how I put it together and add borders and if I call it the trimming, I mean the binding at the edge. Part 3, which will be me quilting and finishing it, will come in October now. That's going to be, it's the last day of August, so that's going to be about mid-September. Make sure you come back and watch that. Meanwhile, this is how we left it at the end of part 1. In my sewing, I'm going to be using reclaimed cotton. And sometimes I put the cotton down and then cut it. You can use any piece of fabric or jelly roll if you're trying to replicate what I'm doing. Where possible, I'll give you the dimensions that you need. Where I'm putting borders on, simply use a jelly roll strip. In choosing my borders, I'm going to make use of the trim that's come off the vintage cotton sheet. That's a double thickness. And then I'm going to use a red. Now I can either do white, red and white bias binding. Problem with the white bias binding is you can see the red through, and I don't like that. So I think I'm going to do the other way, red, white and red. I've cut my strips longer and wider than I need, and because it's really quite a thin cotton, I've folded it over. I'm going to sew 2 pieces together. If you were doing this, do 2 jelly strips together. And I've done it so that the folded edge, I will have a strip of, say, 3 inches. So if you're going to cut a piece, cut a 6-inch strip, fold it half and iron it. And I'm going to fold this edge and sew it right sides together to form a border. Oops, like that, all the way around. So I'm sewing the top border on first and then the bottom border. I've kept the material together, so I actually have the fold underneath the machine. It's easier than cutting it in 2 pieces, and the reason I'm doing it from the patchwork side is so I can see exactly which direction these seams want to sit as I'm sewing it, and where there's a little bit, I've got a little bit of wiggle room here. I've got to make sure I absolutely catch that piece of fabric in that seam, and it'll be easier if I do it this way. In putting the side pieces on, the work is starting to get heavier, so I'm using my basting pins to really keep that fabric firmly in place to stop it from pulling away from the edge. As I get to the corner piece, you'll see why I've cut more fabric than I needed. I'm going to create my own corners, so as I sew up to the edge of the fabric here, I'm going to keep going. And where I've creased the fabric is going to be the equivalent of my edge seam. And I'm going to be able to see where I'm sewing 1/4 of an inch inside that. So I'm taking into account my seam allowance of 1/4 of an inch, and I'm marking it at 3 inches, and I'm going to cut at 3 inches purely because that is easier for me to see on my ruler and I'm less likely to make any mistakes. So the wider red border is on. By the time I do a seam allowance on this, it'll measure about 2.5 inches. And as a white border, I'm going to use this reclaimed cotton. Remember I bought the vintage sheets at Lady Hayes Garden Centre. And I cut the ends off the vintage sheet, and I'm going to make the best use of these now. It's a really good double thickness piece of the same white cotton that I've used in the patchwork quilt. And I think using it in double thickness, it'll give a real sturdy edge. As I cut it off, I kept the seam allowance on here. And I'm going to sew this on to my red border with the folded edge attached, and then I'm going to sew my binding on the inside of this seam allowance before I cut that seam allowance off. This will give me a border of about, I'll measure it, but it'll give me about a 2-inch border. And I'm going to do the headers and the footer before I do the sides, the same way that I did. I'm going to attach them the same way that I did the red borders. I'm not going to mitre these corners, it's too difficult. Where I used reclaimed cotton, you can use any jelly roll strip for this. You just use a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side, 2.5-inch strip, and you'll end up with a 2-inch border. As you'll note when I'm putting the bias binding on, this is very stiff at the moment. This will soften up over the time, and I'm butting the bias binding up against this seam edge. There's a little bit of a ridge there, and when this folds back, I'll be able to get a clean cut here. I've got my new clover cutter, so I might try that out here. I'm going to push back my binding to keep it out of the way, and I'm going to place my edge just up against here. I want to cut here, so I'm cutting this seam off. Skip this stage if you're using a jelly roll or you've used your own seam binding. When I cut this off, I'm going to have 2 layers of white vintage cotton. Oh my goodness me, I love it. That's a new blade, 28mm blade, and it's cut through that so easy. It's really easy for me to hold, and it's lightweight as well. I highly recommend these. Well, there's my finished topper on the bed. The binding is to be turned over, but the size now is 38 by 44. So it's plenty big enough for a throw, just to keep somebody warm over the knees, or when they're watching a film or watching the television. And I'm really pleased how that's turned out. I'm just going to show you some of the pattern. I didn't iron yet. I'm going to iron those borders flat. But actually I'm going to be packing this away for a few weeks, so I might not waste my energy ironing those borders just yet. It needs ironing before I proceed. Right, so the next time I see you, I'll be quilting and finishing. So there, that's the topper of the patchwork throw for Christmas. I'm calling this one a Christmas rose. It's finished now. It's the last day in August, and I'm on holiday next week. So it's going to be September before I get the opportunity to quilt and finish this. When I upload that, that'll be part 3 of this series of videos, and then all I've got to do is work out where to store it before I can parcel it up and send it off to the recipient in December. So I hope you've enjoyed this series. Come back and watch part 3 soon. It'll be a couple of weeks before I get it done. But I hope you've enjoyed spending a bit of time with me. I've still got the fan on. It's going to start getting cooler now as we go into September. So I'll be wanting to do some activity to keep warm, won't we all? Okay, this is Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter, saying, thanks for coming to see me. Come back and see me again soon. Okay, bye for now. Ta-da!